guys, so today's video is all about modern classics. Now you may or may not have seen, but Penguin Classics just released a new range of 50 modern classics by modern classic authors that are intended to give you a bit of an introduction to that author's work. Each one is published in one of these gorgeous tiny little blue books and is going to cost you only £1. And as somebody who is actually a big fan of modern classics, I was incredibly keen to talk more about this range and some of my favourites from it when Penguin approached me to do a sponsored video with them. So I had a peruse of their selection to see what they had on offer and was really pleased by the wide array of authors that I could see there. And I've picked out 10 of the 50 that I in particular would recommend to you, whether you are already a classics reader, a modern classics reader, or are looking to get into the modern classics. Now if you know me, you know I love antiquity. But you probably also know that I love 20th century literature. I have to say my knowledge of the classics from between those two periods is a lot more limited. I have always found myself drawn either to the super old stuff or the stuff from the past century or so, because I think it still has so much relevance to today and you can pick out so much influence from that on literature and history of the contemporary society that we're all living in. And the variety of genres very much increased in the 20th century. But I have picked a selection, so I have 5 fictional works and 5 non-fiction works from different authors, and they're all authors that I would recommend reading, and these are excellent places to start with them. So without further ado, let's get into my introduction to the modern classics. Let's start with a little bit of non-fiction. I have this selection of 5 essays by Audrey Lorde entitled "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," which is one of the essays in the collection. Now all 5 of these essays are actually from the collection published as Sister Outsider, which I've read in its entirety. So as soon as I saw this one on the list, I knew I had to recommend it to you because I adored that whole essay collection, and I think having these 5 essays picked out into this really affordable little volume is a great place to start with both Audrey Lorde but also feminism in the second half of the 20th century and intersectional feminism. Audrey Lorde had a very big impact on the notion of intersectional feminist. She identified herself as a black lesbian feminist, and she very much explores the cross sections of all of those different things, her being a woman, her being a lesbian, her being black, and how her brand of feminism very much reflects all of those aspects of her personhood. So not only do her essays explore women's rights, but they explore racism and homophobia and the importance of valuing the different aspects of people and how that might then lead to different forms of discrimination, and how feminism needs to take them all into consideration. And she's just absolutely phenomenal. So one that it's wonderful to have a little introduction like this to, and I would just highly suggest you all read it. International Women's Day on the 8th of March is fast approaching after all. This may be the perfect one to check out on that day. But in order to demonstrate the huge variety of literature that is available within the realm of modern classics, let's go in the complete opposite direction almost with some science fiction. This is a collection of short stories by Stanisław Lem, a Polish science fiction writer from the mid to late 20th century, and these stories are just absolutely magical. Magical almost feels like the wrong word given that they're science fiction, not fantasy, but I don't know how to better explain them. And I think if you're even vaguely interested in science fiction or you enjoy modern science fiction, this is an author that you should definitely check out. Each of the stories in this collection, including the title story, The 3 Electronites, almost reads like a fairy tale. They are like science fiction fairy tales. They have the sort of structure of perhaps a traditional tale set in a futuristic science fiction otherworldly setting, and it's such a beautiful combination of things that, like I mentioned, I think is something that any science fiction lover should definitely try. And the author's powerful imagination comes through in each one. They completely absorb you and take you to somewhere that you've never imagined before in your own mind. But I'm going to keep the non-fiction fiction pattern going with my next recommendation, which is Notes on on Nationalism by George Orwell. This is a collection of 3 essays, the longest of which is the title essay, and all originally were written in 1945. Despite this, however, I think the title of this one already highlights to you how relevant to today this collection is. The title essay muses on the almost dangerous nature of nationalism and what it does to people in communities and the negative impact that this ideology can have. And like I mentioned, I think many of you will be able to see the relevance of that to today. These discussions never go away, but particularly in the wake of some of the discussions that have been going on in the past few years in Britain and elsewhere, this one just seems particularly relevant, and it's certainly something to get the brain gears moving and thinking on. The second 2 essays are Anti-Semitism in Britain and The Sporting Spirit, and overall the collection explores themes of prejudice, patriotism and power. And given the impact that George Orwell's writing has had on modern culture and literature, he's a modern classic author that is well worth reading, and this is a lovely little introduction to his work. My next fiction recommendation, however, is Shirley Jackson. I'm pretty sure you've heard me mention Shirley Jackson before. I went through quite the phase of reading her fiction a couple of years ago, and I'm still a big fan and have grand intentions of reading all of her novels one of these days. But she was also a writer of short stories, and this volume collects together 3 of her short stories, including the title story, The Missing Girl. Shirley Jackson was an American writer in the mid-1900s who wrote the most unnerving stories and novels you could imagine. Creepy, unnerving, spine-tingling, surreal, all of these words spring to mind when I think of Shirley Jackson's stories and her prose. They completely absorb you as a reader, taking unsettling aspects of our everyday lives and societies and mindsets and pushes them to an extreme in her stories. If you enjoy being at unease or unnerved when you're reading and you haven't read Shirley Jackson, then you are completely missing out. I then have Dark Days by James Baldwin. James Baldwin was an African American born in 1924 and who passed away in 1987, and during that time wrote a large selection of novels and plays and also essays like the ones you'll find in this book, giving speeches on topics like race during periods in American history like the Civil Rights Movement. And race is very much the topic of this collection. It explores historical and systemic racism in the USA and how that has impacted Baldwin's contemporary society in the early, mid and late 20th century, you could say, throughout his lifetime, and even how things have changed in society throughout his life, how his family has moved and the opportunities afforded to white people that aren't afforded to black people in the US. And again, these are still incredibly topical, and they're also semi-biographical in a way. We hear about James Baldwin's life. So if he's a figure that you've ever found yourself interested in, as well as the topics that he explores, then this is an excellent introductory volume to him and his writing and on racism in 20th century America. We then have an author who I could quite easily say was my first proper exposure to the modern classics, and that is Italo Calvino. This is The Distance of the Moon, which collects together a selection of short stories from his Cosmicomics series. I was introduced to Calvino as quite a young reader by my dad, who lent me Italian folk tales to read, which was in a way quite different from these stories, as those were fairy tales, whereas these are more science fiction stories. Calvino's writing is absolutely beautiful, and he just conjures up the most vivid pictures when creating his stories, and all of these cosmicomic tales take what were considered scientific facts during Calvino's day, even if those facts have perhaps been overturned since then, and creates these incredibly imaginative scenes and stories set in these science fiction worlds. Let me just read a couple of sentences to you to really do him justice. In The Distance of the Moon, we are on an Earth where the moon is incredibly close to our planet, and because of this, the people on Earth have their own interactions with the moon. Here it reads, "The spot where the moon was lowest as she went by was off the zinc cliffs. We used to go out with those little rowing boats they had in those days, round and flat, made of cork. They held quite a few of us, me, Captain Vidvid, his wife, my deaf cousin, and sometimes little Zilix. She was 12 or so at that time. On those nights the water was very calm, so silvery it looked like mercury, and the fish in it, violet coloured, unable to resist the moon's attraction, rose to the surface, all of them, and so did the octopuses and the saffron medusas. There was always a flight of tiny creatures, little crabs, squid, and even some weeds, light and filmy and coral plants, that broke from the sea and ended up on the moon, hanging down from the lime-white ceiling, or else they stayed in mid-air, a phosphorescent swarm we had to drive off, waving banana leaves at them. I don't know what it is, but Italo Calvino's writing always manages to take me away from the world I'm currently living in and to his strange and spectacular imaginary world, so that I couldn't recommend his writing more highly. Next up for non-fiction, however, we have Chinua Achebe, who is often described as the father of modern African literature. Now, whereas Chinua Achebe is probably most well known for his fiction writing, this is actually a collection of essays and speeches that he wrote in the latter half of the 20th century and actually the very beginning of the 21st century, which brings up an interesting discussion of where the lines that delineate modern classics begin and end, but they are incredibly fascinating. Now, Chinua Achebe was from Nigeria, and in essays like Africa's Tarnished Name, he explores what it means to be Nigerian, his experience as a Nigerian, his positive and negative relationship with the country he was born and raised in. So a great introduction to African literature and Chinua Achebe if that's something that you are interested in. Next up I have Till September Petronella by Jean Rhys. Now, Jean Rhys is probably best known for Wide Sargasso Sea, which is a prequel that she wrote to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And in this collection of short stories, like in that novel, she explores different aspects of women's lives. And each one of these stories is just such a wonderful piece of bite-sized literature and a wonderful introduction to a really influential woman's writing. Jean Rhys was no typical woman for the time she lived in, born in the late 1800s and writing in the 1900s. She engaged in extramarital relationships, she was divorced, she was a writer, an artist, and things that women of that time were not encouraged to do, and it's so wonderful to see what came out of such an interesting person's life. And in fact, the final story in this collection, I Used to Live Here Once, is but 2 pages long, not even 2 pages long, more like a page and a half, yet it will probably have you mulling on it and its meaning and its themes for at least 10 times as long as it took you to read it. But for my final non-fiction selection, before I get onto my final fiction selection, I have Crate Dangerously by Albert Camus. Camus was a French philosopher from the early to mid 20th century, and in the title essay in this collection he explores the topic of the responsibility of writers, what it means to be an artist and a writer, and the responsibility of creating things and putting them out into the world. How much realism an author should strive for, should he strive to connect with his contemporary or a future audience, is writing a luxury, or is in fact good writing that fulfills this responsibility to society in fact the complete opposite? Does it put you in a position of danger? And it's an incredibly fascinating contemplation on the topic, and I think anybody who either considers himself a writer or just likes to consume art and what other people have written would take something away from this essay at least. But last but certainly not least, I have to mention John Steinbeck. This is a collection of 3 short stories by John Steinbeck, including The Vigilante. John Steinbeck is an early 20th century author who, although not my first exposure to the modern classics, was certainly the first author of the modern classics time period that I ever studied in detail. He was one of the earliest books that I studied in secondary school. We have a story from the perspective of a man involved in a mob lynching in America that will make you feel incredibly uncomfortable. In fact, uncomfortable is a feeling you will probably feel throughout this collection. Another story about a man who's visited by a strange woman who wants to buy a snake from him. And a third story about a woman living a mundane, dissatisfying life and looking for something more. Whether they make you feel uncomfortable or intrigued, they will all have you thinking. And John Steinbeck is just an incredibly skillful writer. But those are my 10 recommendations for getting your introduction into the modern classics, a vast array of literature, and I know it's difficult to know where to start with all of that, but hopefully at least one of these authors has sparked an interest in you, because I hope I've managed to pick a sort of wide array of different things, although all of which I really enjoy. But before I go, I would love to know a few things from you. If you have a favourite author from the 20th century that you would recommend to me, or even a favourite work. And of the 50 Penguin moderns that have just been released, which one are you the most excited to read? Until next time though, happy reading, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!